one of the greatest artists of his generation, a singer and guitarist famous for his deadpan voice and distinctive lyrics, who had a huge influence on the shape of rock music, one of rock and roll's most original if wayward artists, who lived much of his life close to the edge. With a career spanning 6 decades, his most inspired moments both within the foremost avant-garde rock group of the 60s and in his subsequent long and varied solo career qualify him as one of the most influential musicians of the past 70 years. Today's history maker is the rock poet of New York, Lou Reed. Born Louis Allen Reed in Brooklyn, he grew up on Long Island, New York, and began to play rock and roll in high school bands in his teens. A disturbed personality was diagnosed early, and at the age of 17, he was sent by his parents for electroshock treatment in an attempt to cure him of severe mood swings. Having played guitar and sung in doo-wop groups in high school, Reed studied poetry at Syracuse University under Delmore Schwartz, who was a writer hailed as a literary lion in the making by T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, but by the time he was teaching, Reed was the epitome of unfulfilled promise. However, it was Schwartz's example of mixing high and lowbrow idioms that gave Reed the idea to take a poet or novelist's approach to songs so the lyrics could stand alone. Reed played music on campus under numerous band names and served as a radio DJ, hosting a late-night avant-garde music program while still at college. After graduating from Syracuse, he went to work for Pickwick Records in New York City. It was low-budget stuff, cheap cash-ins on current hits sold in the budget supermarket bins, but his talent became apparent when one of his compositions, The Ostrich, released under the name The Primitives, became a minor hit. A group was swiftly assembled to promote the record, which included Welsh-born musician John Cale. He was a viola player who had trained with the contemporary classical composer Lamont Young, and the two men would go on to form the Velvet Underground. The pair, who were interested in combining rock music with the avant-garde, recruited guitarist Sterling Morrison and drummer Maureen Tucker. With Reed at the helm, they stretched the boundaries of rock and roll and created a sound that had never been heard before. They added the experimental streak of the art studio and the abrasive realism of 1960s Manhattan. On top of their musical innovation, the group's lyrics often displayed dark or explicit themes that had rarely been addressed so openly on record before. They became darlings of the New York avant-garde scene, and they caught the attention of artist Andy Warhol, who became the group's manager and producer. Warhol paired the group with icy-voiced German-born singer Nico, who he billed as the pop girl of '66, as well as making them the house band at his seminal Factory studio. They provided the live soundtrack to Warhol's multimedia shows that paired screenings of the artist's films with dance, live performances, and music. The shows were not universally acclaimed, with Cher quoted as saying, it will replace nothing except suicide. Between 1966 and 1970, the New York-based Velvets made 4 powerful albums which explored the dark side of human nature. Warhol produced the group's first album, The Velvet Underground, and Nico. He also designed its distinctive cover, a peel-off banana, based on one of his screen prints. Although it was recorded in 1966, the album did not appear until the following year after major labels had rejected it due to its lyrical content. Songs like Heroin and I'm Waiting for the Man were blatant drug songs, while Venus in Furs dealt with sadomasochism. Released at the height of the Summer of Love, its urban intensity was out of step with the spirit of the times, and it was doomed to commercial failure. New York radio even banning it for its explicit references to drugs and sex. However, subsequently, it was to become one of the most influential debut albums in rock, prompting the claim that although hardly anyone bought it, everyone who did formed a band. With the departure of the German singer Nico and the ending of Warhol's role, Reed tightened his control as both main songwriter and lead vocalists. White Light, White Heat, the second Velvet album, was released in 1968 and featured radical experiments in atonality and such uncompromising compositions of gothic horror and black humour, such as songs Sister Ray and The Gift. Internal conflicts led to the departure of Cale, the group's most accomplished musician, and Reed was very much in charge on the third album, 1969's quieter and more introspective Velvet Underground. The following year saw the release of Loaded, but by the time that album was released, Reed was ready to quit. While their albums gained little attention beyond the underground scene at the time, the Velvet Underground are now considered one of the most influential bands in the history of rock music. After a 2-year hiatus where he became a virtual recluse, Reed resurfaced in London in 1972 to record his debut solo album, which was simply entitled Lou Reed, which surprisingly featured members of the overblowing progressive rock band Yes. David Bowie, then at the height of his Ziggy Stardust glam rock phase, was a more congenial soulmate, and they began working together. 1972's Transformer, which featured a heavily made-up Reed on the cover in the style of the period, was co-produced by Bowie and his guitarist Mick Ronson. It included 2 of Reed's most enduring and popular songs, In Perfect Day and Walk on the Wild Side. Both became hits. Reed and Bowie became inseparable companions, and lurid stories filtered out of their hedonistic excess and debauchery. Yet, in what was to become a career trademark, Reed retreated from the commercial success of Transformer to make the darker, less accessible concept album Berlin. While it was unappreciated at the time, it is now seen as a masterpiece. However, it is that and Transformer that have done the most to cement his reputation as a rock pioneer in his own right. The same cannot necessarily be said about 1975's Metal Machine, an impenetrable avant-garde double set which was described memorably by one critic as, quote, 4 sides of whines, whistles, feedback and screams. It sold so badly that for a time his record label, RCA, withdrew it from its catalogue. This pattern would continue throughout most of his solo career, following good albums with the downright dire Coney Island Baby, followed by Rock and Roll Heart, Street Hassle, followed by Growing Up in Public. Despite the erratic output, his reputation continued to grow. In the 1980s, he had many surprising collaborations, but perhaps none more so than at the end of the decade when he was working once again with Cale, this time on an album called Songs for Drella, a fiction, which they performed as a tribute to Andy Warhol, who had died. That decade was completed with the satisfying album 1989's New York, which displayed strong flashes of his old sharp and caustic wit. He followed it encouragingly with 1992's Magic and Loss, which made number 6 in the British album charts, his highest ever placing. Reid would die at the end of October 2013 from liver disease at the age of 71. He had released 4 studio albums with the Velvet Underground and an additional 22 solo albums. He had also released countless compilations and live albums, mapping out a whole new world for pop and rock musicians to explore in the 1960s. That you can try anything, you can go anywhere, and you don't have to learn to play well, effectively enabling rock music as we know it to be born. The idea drove Iggy Pop, David Bowie, and the New York Dolls, then influenced the punk bands of the 1970s and well beyond. One of the foremost rock stars of his generation, it has been said, a musician as important as the Beatles, Lou Reed was truly a history maker.